On behalf of FCRP Collaborative on Spirit and Psyche, let me start by welcoming you all. In case you're not familiar, FCRP stands for Friends Conference on Religion and Psychology, which is a volunteer-run nonprofit Quaker organization that for 83 years has been convening to inspire inner journeys for change in the world, featuring some of the most prestigious names in our field: Bessel van der Kolk, Stephen Porges, Robert Bly, Marion Woodman, and many other names that you would recognize as some of the most inspiring and impactful thinkers and teachers of our time. Our featured guest today, Tom Holmes, is the latest to join this long list of acclaimed teachers. We can't be more thrilled to have him here on our first ever speaker series event. And he is also going to be our keynote speaker for the upcoming FCRP conference in Pendle Hill, May 23rd, coming up in just a few months. So this conversation is an intimate opportunity to get to know Tom, to learn about his model for healing and transformation, integrating internal family systems and spirituality. And as I said, this is our first speaker series event. So we decided to make it free, to make it accessible to as many people as possible, and to keep expectations low and goodwill high, because none of us are particularly tech savvy. So keep that in mind as we roll along. First, a little housekeeping. We are recording, and we'll ask you all to please stay muted. We're expecting, close to 100 people, so that will keep the background noise down. Also, if you get inspired or you have a question during the talk, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and then we'll have a little time for Q&A towards the end. After Q&A, we'll take a 5-minute break, and we will invite you to join us for breakout discussion rooms. And this is totally voluntary, but for a lot of people, there might be a desire or a need to process a bit more or to discuss and share in a smaller group setting. And we have on hand some really superb facilitators to have that at the end. So if you're interested, you're welcome to join us for that, but there's no obligation whatsoever. It's a 1-hour program. So here I'm going to introduce Tom. Let me just take this little thing off of my screen. There we go. So for those of you who don't know Tom and his work, you are in for a real treat. Last year, we had Tom as our keynote speaker at FCRP. And as you may recall, it was a time of great apprehension and worry for many of us. Many of us were aware we were in a moment that could potentially really change the political landscape. For many of us, it was a very anxious time. But we gathered at Pendle Hill, and under Tom's guidance, many of us, most of us, all of us left transformed in a place so much more clear and grounded, and really feeling able to meet the moment that was headed our way with so much more grounding and calm and clarity. So we did something really very rare. I don't want to say unprecedented, but very, very rare. We invited him back to a keynote for us again this year. And this conversation we're having today is an opportunity for people who were at that conference to just give us a little bit of Tom, before the conference, because it's been a while, Tom, and we want and need to hear from you. But it's also an opportunity for people who've not met you and who've not seen your work to just get a smidge of who you are and how you work and how you think about things. So that's what was the inspiration for this. So let me just say a little bit about Tom's biography. Tom's had a long and very intentional career. He has a Ph.D. in counseling psychology and is a professor emeritus of Western Michigan University. He's been training graduate students in psychotherapy since 1985, and for the past 30 years, he's been teaching in the holistic healthcare program at Western Michigan. His specialty area is spirituality and the therapeutic process. He did his original training in IFS with Richard Schwartz in the late 80s, sorry to date you, and has been teaching, training, and practicing IFS since then. He was only 2 at the time. It's a miracle. In recent years, Tom's focus has been on burnout prevention, healing the healer, and integrating Western psychology with Buddhist and Sufi teachings, as well as Christianity, Judaism, and Daoism. Tom is the author of a widely acclaimed book, Parts Work, an illustrated guide to your inner life, a beautifully illustrated and practical guide to understanding and transforming inner dynamics. With over 100,000 copies sold, this book has been a cornerstone for a lot of people who are studying IFS. Tom has also traveled the world as a teacher and trainer, touching down in areas such as South Korea, Ukraine, and hotspots in the Middle East. So, Tom, I thought to start, maybe you could talk a little bit about how this interface with FCRP has impacted you. You know, you've done a lot of intimate work with our group since last year. Can you just say a little bit about how that's impacted you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mary, and happy birthday also. Thank you for giving up a little bit of your birthday time to this community.
Thank you. This is the highlight of my birthday. So
Okay. All right. Well, the coming together with the FCRP has been a really wonderful gift in my life, I must say. It came at the right time. It's one of those synchronicities I think that Jung talked about when in your life you hit a harmonic with something. And Jan Mullen, contacted me last fall or a year and a half ago in fall, and said, "Tom, you might be interested in this FCRP event that happens on Memorial Day, and you might be interested if you're interested in maybe putting your hat in the ring. They might invite you to share on that weekend." And what was the synchronicity there was that I had just decided that year that I was going to completely let go of the training process of internal family systems and focus on the integration of spirituality and internal family systems. So this gave me a perfect forum to continue this sort of unfolding. And I hadn't done much in the United States. I've mostly worked around the world, and I was looking for some ways of doing something. But the other thing was that was so perfect for me was the theme that they wanted to address was how can IFS and spirituality help us during this time when war is so present in the world and there's so much suffering arising out of those conditions. And that's been my focus for the last 5 or 6 years in particular. And so it's like, whoa, that would be a wonderful thing. And then I hadn't expected the wonderful gift of interfacing with the committee for the time beforehand and having a chance to share with them, to learn more about the whole history of the um, spirituality in the Quaker tradition. I had been along for much of my adult life. We've been supporters of the FCRP or the Friends Committee on Social Action and the various service activities that the Friends do. It's always been the one place where we always trust giving money. It's like, oh, that's our first place, and then we can see what we do after that. So, and we've attended Friends meetings over the years, but never really had a deep understanding, or I didn't anyway.
yes.
And so and Lori, my wife, and I had the opportunity to come, she was also delighted to be able to do something with me where I'd offer it in English, where she could also participate because I'm often doing it in some other language. And so what was wonderful for me was that coming to Pendle Hill was like coming home. I have this little saying up here from Thich Nhat Hanh about I have arrived, I am home, and a sense of coming back to the center of yourself. And I felt like, oh, there's a community that feels like home. It has a homeness to it. And the interaction during that weekend felt very harmonious for me with that which I most wish to offer. And it felt like what you were describing came out of that weekend was a co-creation. And I've always felt that's one of the things about my path is that I think every therapeutic process I enter into with people is a co-creation and it's shaped according to them. And the goal is gradually that they lead the process, right? And I sort of support that and facilitate that as best I can. And so that very much felt that way. And it felt like, given the resonance in the community, that was mutual. feeling.
Mm.
And then when I got invited back, I was delighted because it was like, wow, okay. So that was I had a sense in my heart that that was there, but then I knew, oh, okay, that was also felt in other people's hearts.
Yeah.
And it also gives me a chance to reflect more deeply on how we center ourselves in these times. And I remember when I was first approached by the committee, they said, we were looking one way at how this would happen. And I said, I think we should wait till after the election to see what we're going to focus on, because it's going to be very different depending on what happens. But then, as I imagine most of you, we had no imagination of what would really happen
Mhm.
on January 20th.
Mhm.
So uh, yeah, so I'm been delighted. It's changed my life, and I've begun to. One of the things I'm interested in sharing is more of those convergences, especially between Jung was very important to me when I was in my young studies in the 70s and the 80s. And I'd kind of left some of that. So this was a chance to come back to that and then to look a little bit more deeply at something called Quaker mysticism, which I hadn't even heard about until I was starting to read some of John Youngblood's stuff. And so, yeah, it's a delight for me to be here.
Yeah. So much of what you're just talking about reminded me of one of my previous teachers, Mary Lou Shack, talked about this concept in the therapeutic process called moments of mutuality, which as a clinician, you just described it. You feel it when something's happening. And of course, we're always wanting to be paying attention to our transference and countertransference experience and kind of being in service to the client always. But when something beyond the clinical encounter has happened. And I think that's the space where spirituality may be entering the clinical relationship. And if we're not aware of that language, personally, that's not my bent. So that's not how I've always framed it. But as you were saying it, I thought, oh, I'll bet that's the spirituality part. Right?
And that fits with Jung talked about there was this um, thing that periodically happens in the therapeutic process where both are transformed in a
Yeah.
significant way. And that's those moments that you're describing. It is this mutuality moment, and we can open to that. And I think that's what happened there for me. I was changed by that event, right? So it was one of those things that was that kind of IFS self space or heart
Mhm.
space, I would call it.
Right. What a wonderful segue. So I was hoping for, not everyone here knows a lot about IFS. Some of us are just beginning our IFS journey or some of the vocabulary for it. Can you, obviously there's not a ton we can do in this short period of time, but can you give us the big concepts and the ways that IFS might be different from the models that most of us are familiar with, just so we can get a little bit of a grounding in what we're talking about with IFS?
Yeah, and I'm gonna try and do this in a compact way.
Of
I'm gonna
course.
do what I normally do, which is rely a little bit on art, right? So in order to do that, I have to manage to get a screen shared and get up on that process. So I'm going to do that right now, and then I'll come back to you. Let's see, this should happen. Yes. All right. Okay, so one of those synchronicities in life was that when I first started being trained by Schwartz in IFS, I also did a week-long retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh. And it was a retreat a mindfulness retreat of 600 people. And I've shared this story last time, but it's a really important story to me that we had this retreat where in the middle of this retreat were 60 American Vietnam vets who had fought in the war. And he was making it his business, and the nuns and the monks were making it their business to heal our soldiers from their experience in that war. And as someone who was raised Christian, to learn to love your enemy, I thought, oh my goodness, this Buddhist monk is teaching us how to do that. And at the end of that retreat, the many of the soldiers reported sleeping through the night for the first time without nightmares. And So it touched me in a way because how how do you have that kind of heart space? And so that was more than 30 years ago. And I've been searching and studying and looking at ways that we can arrive at that kind of space that we can engage suffering from a place of peacefulness and not burnout and do what we can to bring healing. And one of the synchronicities was that at that same conference, he presented this model of Buddhist psychology that I immediately saw its parallels with IFS. And so that's what I'm just going to share real briefly.
Mm.
So Thich Nhat Hanh said there's two levels of consciousness. There's this store consciousness down below, where all of the seeds of the mental formations, or the different parts of ourselves, the states of mind, the ego states, are stored. And those are affected by our genetic history, our personal history, our family history, our cultural history. All those things affect those seeds. And when certain conditions are right on the inside and the outside, a particular state of mind arises into the foreground, right? And right now, it could be that you have a part like this in the foreground that's still interested in what I'm saying. We're only 10 minutes, 15 minutes into it, right? So you have a part that's interested. And my understanding of what these parts are in this internal systems model is it's the system giving us the state of mind that we need to best cope with the internal and external conditions we're facing, right? So when you're in a learning situation, it's useful to have a curious part there, a part that wants to learn, wants to study, right? It's also possible that you have a scientific part that says, now, wait a minute, is there evidence of this? And you can reassure that part of you right now that there's good mounting scientific evidence for IFS, right? And showing that it's effective in a wide range of interventions, right? But it's important that we honor that part as well as our curious part, and we bring them to the meeting, right? Because they all have a function. It could also be that you have a skeptic, oh no, one more strange idea, integrating this here or there. And it's also useful for us to have a skeptical part, a part that doubts about what's being said until we see that it makes sense to us. One of the core principles of IFS is that all parts are welcome. They all have their job. And our job as the therapist is to help a person explore their system. And as Schwartz says, there's no bad parts, right? There are parts that are maybe causing us and others harm. And it's important that we get to know them and to befriend them so that we can get out of those loops that cause harm in the world, that are imbalanced. Right? But the original intention of those parts, even though they're now doing things that are harmful, was a positive intention for the system, right? Um, I'm just going to give a really brief example of how this affects our life as we engage with suffering and struggles in the world.
Yeah.
So many of us have very well developed helper parts, right? They want to go out and do things in the world. They want to make the world a better place, right? And so we go through and we get all this training like this part to do this or to do that. But the thing is, the suffering is so overwhelming often that we feel more like this, and our parts are burning out. And I have to say that in the late 80s, when I first encountered the IFS model, actually through my wife Lori, who was at a family systems conference and encountered Schwartz there, and he'd switched over to this internal systems model. And so thanks to her, I got to know a new model, which actually ended up helping this guy a lot. Because I had been working in other therapeutic models, including Jungian models, for quite some time, trying basically with the theme of, I want to stop being a therapist, right? So I was burned out, basically. And I had been doing therapy for 15 years, and it was like I just didn't feel it was enough. And I was teaching it at the university too. Right? So I went into the therapy and we got to know this part. And it turns out that this part wasn't alone in the living room. He had another part, the helper part, had this part that I call Steel. Steel is my marathon runner. I did also run marathons at those times. Steel knows no pain and no fatigue. And he had paired up with Helper, which was a really problematic alliance in my inner system because Helper with Steel can help till he drops, right? And you probably may have had known times in your life when you're staying engaged with the helping much longer than you need to be. As we worked with Steel, we realized there was another part that both of those guys were working really hard for, and that was my burdened little boy, right?
Mm.
And so by getting to know this burdened part, we could help little Tommy, I call him, to not pick up stuff in the therapy sessions, right? That was weighing him down, and it was activating memories of early trauma in my own life that kind of caused Tommy to become overworking, and then kind of motivating the whole helper team. So for all of us, it's kind of important to get to know our inner system so we can find out those things that lead us to burnout, right? And so that's one of the primary ways that just a very brief way. What I wanted to do with showing you this is how I use art in the process of both teaching and in the process of doing our inner work, because it's a really key thing for me. And I also want to say right here that this artist, Sharon Eckstein, who's been such a gift to me to work together with her, and she created these therapy cards. She passed away about a month ago, and
Mm.
she had been on the edge of life for 3 years. And actually, on my website, if you go to my website, uh, you will see a piece that she wrote about her death that is really quite significant. A lot of people are finding just a page and a half piece. But she's going to be one of those memories that I carry with me this year, along with the memory of my spiritual guide and mentor, Atum O'Kane, who passed this year. And so it's one of those times where people who are peers to me are are moving on, right? And so I'm very aware of impermanence, and I'm delighted to have this interface with the FCRP and the community that arises at Pendle Hill to to spend this time that when I'm still here, offering that thing which is most important in my heart. And really, I'll stop here. One of the things that's most important for me is helping people to find that place in them that wishes to be expressed. When I was 55 and I was still at the university, I had the experience of feeling I wasn't doing what my heart's desire really was. And I was losing myself in the academia.
Yeah.
And uh, I was able to listen deeply in and find enough spiritual guidance um, that I could find my path of the heart. And that path of the heart is something that this mixture of spirituality and IFS can help people find in their own life. So that's one of my motivations for doing these workshops, is to help people tune into that.
Wow, you just said so much in that last paragraph that I am sure really deeply resonated for so many of us, particularly clinicians, but also people who aren't clinicians, but who just care deeply about the world and the humans in it and all living things. Um,
Yes.
and are sensing our overwhelm at trying to meet this moment and to try to feel effective, to try to feel grounded, but you tied in the impermanence. And I think that that's such a really, that's such an important thing that when we're young, we don't think about it because we have the luxury of most of us not having to think about it. And then when we're old, this sense of urgency that can sometimes catch up with us. And without having a model like this, where we can hone in on what is my heart's desire. And if I'm not on my heart path, um, how can I right myself? And what are the tools? And I can see now how you described all of those different parts that are that are in there and that have always been in there in service to us, but how
Right.
we may need to call on them as we are winding down our lives to make sure that each part has been known and seen, that
Yeah.
that is probably the source of a lot of our unfinishedness,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I hope for in coming together in groups and community, with a sort of intention to listen to what that heart is, that sacred space in us that IFS calls self, but I see as a sacred space. It's the center of our both our psyche, but also is in connection with the source, with the light, with however we imagine and name the source.
Mhm.
But it's that heart that allows the transformation of that which comes to us from the divine and allows it to manifest into form through the actions of our parts in the world. So one of the things that the interfaces between spirituality and IFS is that IFS offers a really great way to get to know our parts so that as they become known, they open up space in the center of us, right? And they come into harmony. And I study traditions around the world, spiritual traditions that have also ways of supporting that coming into harmony of the inner system, right?
Can you give a few examples? Because I think I got to experience some of that at the workshop. And I think that would be a neat thing to share about how does one do that? What are some of the ways?
Well, if I look at how I do that in workshops, I mean, one of the things that I love to do is to come together in groups and move and sing together, right? So I was, I was pretty ignorant about the Quaker way, and I was thinking, well, can we sing? Can I do my peace dances there? Is that going to work? Right? And uh, and what happens is these songs are deep. They're basically mantric practices that have arisen out of the various spiritual traditions. And so we get to draw on what are some of the peace traditions within the Jewish traditions, with this in the Islamic tradition, in the Christian tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, and how can we invite those energies to enrich our path? We don't have to take up the path of any of those, but we can allow it to enrich our path and find that there's a commonality once we enter into that space of this heart space. So we can sing Shabbat Shalom, and we can sing Assalamu Alaikum, and we can sing Salam Abeta, which is peace be upon this house in Aramaic. And the Aramaic, that was the language that Jesus would have spoken. That was the Jewish community spoke 200 years before the Common Era and 200 years afterwards. And so it was certainly the language he used. And it has such a lot of resonance in it. So I like to use sound practices from that and use those to tune in. And I find that those are moving meditations with people are one of the deepest for me. Um, and what arises out of that then once we have connected with that and we can connect to our source, then we turn towards our inner system and we use the cards that Sharon developed and that I've gotten from the artist in the Syrian artists in the refugee camps in Jordan, and artists from a Black American artist here in the United States, and created these cards which allows us to get to know our parts and to get to know our inner story. And so we turn towards that side of our life, our manifest side, with this connection both to community, to coming together, and to spirit in whatever way we do that. And then we turn towards our manifest life that comes through the parts. And we get to know, okay, so if we take the theme, let's say, all right, what's happening right now for the last 3 or 4 weeks, right?
Mm.
Um, and we look at the parts, and we might have one part that's feeling hopeless and helpless, I can't do anything. It's overwhelming. We don't know where to turn. I have other parts that are very aware of the suffering, immediate suffering that is happening because of the USAID cutting of funds. I mean, it's unbelievable the suffering that's happening because of that. I'm aware of the suffering of the Palestinian people in the um, uh,
In
uh,
Gaza and
in
those.
Gaza, I'm working with my Jordanian colleagues, and we're trying to arrange an IFS training in the West Bank, knowing the trauma that people are coming out of, you know, and Israel has the resources of a lot of IFS trainers, so that's a gift for that community to come through this time. Um, but this other community is without much, and it's carrying tremendous suffering. um, I'm working with my Ukrainian friends, right?
Mm,
And so how do we, so we have all these parts. Where do I start? What do I do? So you can tell one of the things that I do is I turned and I said, okay, what can I do as a person? You know, luckily I have friends in Lebanon and Jordan and Ukraine that I can directly support and do some things that will make a difference directly with them. But also right here in town, all of a sudden, all the refugees from all over the world that have arrived expecting to have support, the money's gone, both the money that would have either allow them to live here, but also the money for the support services is all gone, right? So what do we do for those people? You know, and if we have money, we can give money to them. If we don't have so much money, there's other things that we can do to help them because now they're really without service. So I turn towards what can I touch in the world around me,
mhm,
right? So that's part of my soothing in terms of action parts, right?
mm,
And first, I can also listen to the parts that feel hopeless or tired. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm getting old, right? I'm really tired, and I don't have the energy to do this. And what it's a tidal wave. How does our little bit help? And then I remember Thich Nhat Hanh, who faced horrible suffering in Vietnam. He organized people to rebuild the villages after we destroyed them. Right? And he came back and worked for peace and worked to heal our people. And he said, peace is every step. So every single step we take where we remember to recenter into that peaceful place, every time we reconnect to the source, every time we're able to turn compassionately towards ourselves or others, each of those little moments is a moment of healing and sends out. In the Sufi tradition, they have this idea that life is sort of like a dome, and you send out a vibration into that dome. And so every little thing you do sends out a vibration into the dome, and it will echo all through the world and all through that dome, and eventually come back, right? Um, so that with that belief, then it's a belief that every little action can make a difference.
If I leave here with nothing else, the image of the dome, I think, is going to be so helpful for me. Because, and even from a physics standpoint, even from a karma standpoint, there's so many other models that try to describe what you just said, but I needed that picture of a dome. It's curved and everything bounces off and it's contained and it stays inside. And depending on where you shoot it, it shoots back at that angle. And so that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. And so we each need to find our own images of what returns us to that
Mhm,
place, what
mhm,
what resonates with us.
mhm. Yeah,
And not everything will,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um, but we choose those things that do.
yeah. You mentioned the cards, and I wanted to just comment on that. That small group experience was one of the more powerful moments that I had in this workshop because it impacted on two different levels. One was using these images and cards. You know, we selected, I think it was 6 cards that just we felt a resonance or a connection with. And then we sat with those cards and tried to get to know what parts do these represent. And we had that dialogue with ourselves, which was very powerful because there were some guide questions that you used for us to kind of get there, which was very helpful. But then we shared them with our small group, and that was intimacy on a very different level that I had experienced with five strangers. Um, what an what a quick way to get to know the important parts of a person. As someone who's never speed dated, that I imagine I don't think I'd like the experience because I feel like it takes some time to really get to know a person. How can you know what to ask in 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it is? But after having seen those cards, I think that the solution to the speed dating lack of depth problem is to just have everybody pick 6 cards and then just share their cards. Here's why I picked this card. Here's what this represents for me. Because my God, the people that I connected with during that group, that connection stays with me because we got to heart connections very quickly based on those cards.
It's a gift from the universe. And that happens all over the world.
Yeah,
You know, it allows people to tell their story in a very compact and focused way. And it's really amazing how that does that.
yeah,
But the stories are so, and what you just described is what we hear. Lori was the facilitator of a small group at one of the IFS conferences, and this guy on the way back was talking to her, and he says, I just shared more with that group than almost anybody in my life knows about me. Right?
right, right,
It's
right.
sort of like, what? What was that you just did? Right?
Right. And so many of us bought those cards. We thought, let's take that magic home. Right?
Yeah, so
Yeah,
it's a gift, and it's one of the ways that Sharon will live on. And
yeah,
she actually she died and came back to life about 4 years ago.
wow.
And when she was, I had always been telling her over the years, Sharon, these cards are really doing a lot in the world. And she thought, this is Tom being nice, right? And then after that, she kind of she went away, and she came back, and she says, you know what, Tom? I get it now. Something's happened. Something was transmitted, and I really believe that. And it's not just her cards, because there's the other cards there.
Right.
It's coming through the artist, but also those artists, the Syrian artists that were in the refugee camp, most of those cards, I gave them the PowerPoint that I do and the little card exercise, and a week later, most of those cards were created. It just flowed out of them,
Yeah.
right?
And they produced these works of art, these little works of art for these cards. They were amazing. And that is a tool, for those of us who are looking for concrete things, what can we do when we sit with our clients to help them get to a new place of connection with themselves and with us as their therapist and others in their lives? We can bring a deck of those cards in and have people actually do that, set up the cards and do that in person in our office. And that doesn't have to be a group experience. I mean, that's a,
No, it doesn't. And yeah, that's right. And mhm,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a doorway.
Let me look at my little list of questions. Of course, we already kind of covered a lot of what I was going to ask. Can you say a little bit about what your thoughts are for the upcoming FCRP conference? What's on your mind and in your heart, and what are your goals? What are you hoping to do there this year?
Well, one of the things that we've been doing as the committee, as we kind of ponder what is the most useful thing, we're going to try and restructure. We're listening to what people resonated most deeply with, and we're looking at creating. I mean, one of the things was that there was kind of a time compression at times because we tried to do so much
Mm.
in that period of time. So we're hoping to give a little more space, and like taking that group experience with the cards, and there's some follow-up things that can happen with that, maybe taking a little more time with that. So we're looking at ways that we can um, keep the flow going in a way that people most resonated to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So That's
Nice.
that's one of my main things there was and we'll continue to do this for the next month or two, just to reflect on, okay, what's most important as we structure this time. And one of the things we have, like the facilitators that we have today for the small groups, we'll have people like that, providing actually the continuity of moving through both the card exercise and then some other exercises with mapping our inner system, with spending a little more time with that, getting to know our parts that way, encountering them in some other guided imagery ways that we didn't have a chance to do.
Mhm.
So I'm hopeful to have a little more of that space.
Nice. Yeah, and for people who were there last year, that would be a nice continuation, but it sounds like it would be a fine place to start for people who come new and they haven't had that groundwork before. It sounds like you can
Yeah.
just hop in and start wherever you are.
Absolutely. And for the people coming back, one of the things I'm going to be doing is working a little more deeply, integrating some of the Jungian and some of the Quaker insights into spirituality into what I'm doing. So I'm letting that kind of percolate now, and I'm about to, in a month I'll leave for, or 3 weeks I'll be leaving for Europe to do a series of workshops, and I'm going to be exploring and experimenting with new ways of bringing some of those things in, and then I'll bring those in May to the conference for the ones that seem to be flowing. So it's going to be just part of me. Um, I'm just changed by the invitation to come back,
Yeah.
and I want to let that percolate, and I will bring, my best understanding of whatever is new um, into the um, to the weekend.
Yeah. Just maybe quickly, what are you getting from your work in the Middle East, in Ukraine? What can you share with us that, I mean, we're obviously
Yeah.
in a real tough place right now, but you're going to some of the hot spots in the world where the struggles are just so visceral daily. What are you getting from there that you could share with us here that we could use?
Well, um, it was interesting when I arrived in Lviv a little over a year ago. Um, the it's tricky. How do you work with helping people to go inside and get to know themselves when there's so much danger in the external environment?
Yeah.
So I was trying to balance. I mean, one of the things you can't do. I mean, you can't spend too much time in a undifferentiated inner kind of guided process either, because
Yeah.
there's so many demons that are arising because of the trauma in the environment.
Yeah.
Um, but what happened was we did the kind of things that we did at Pendle Hill,
Oh,
which was to, again, and interestingly enough, they were open to the movement exercises, but I had to adapt what I was doing. I, the peace dances, peace is a complicated word when you're in a place where you have an
or
aggressor
more. Yep.
attacking you, right? Because peace feels like capitulation.
Yeah.
So it's a really polarized kind of thing, which was really hard for my parts that are peacemakers, right? It's like, wait a minute, I can't not use that word, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I selected the kinds of dances that were in attunement and that opened the heart, and then we used the cards and the cards from the refugees, because they were created as these refugees came out of the bombing in Syria and the war experiences. So these cards really addressed these people's life experiences, and they were able with the cards, it managed to share enough, but without being too regressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the images are external, they're contained, they weren't regressive, right?
Yeah.
And so people could articulate something, they could tell a narrative from that. And they really found that self-heart space, even in this only 2-day workshop that I had with them, 2.5 days, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that some of the people told to me that really moved me was I came back to myself this weekend. I've been gone for a year and a half, right? I was able to take my protector parts and allow them to both be honored, but to find a place on the side. So I think what we can learn by that is the first step is to honor our protectors. So that's what I did a lot of in the beginning. You
Yeah,
know, thank your protectors, get to know how they do work, how do they help you, what do they do, you know. So we really, all those parts of us, those states of mind that are keeping us safe, we honor them, right?
nice.
And once we've done that, then there's a little bit of space for some of the vulnerable parts who haven't had space, right? Because when you're in a dangerous situation, it's not safe to make contact with your vulnerable parts. So you have to be in a situation. And with this one, because we had a group of 40 or 50 people who were being very supportive of each other, they
Mm,
could allow themselves in the small groups to touch and share some of their vulnerability at the same time that they're acknowledging their strength.
nice. Would you say what you just described would be also a frame for how to use this model to work directly with trauma? Because what you're
Um,
describing sounds like a sim for people who are in a really who are still very much inside their trauma. That what you just described sounds like a wonderful.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's characteristic of the internal family systems work, the IFS work, is that we really honor the protective parts, the defenses. We don't try and push past the defenses. We see the defenses as being functional helpers in the system. So we honor those parts. We get to know them. We get to know what they're afraid would happen if they didn't do what they're doing. We help them to work out, well, what would make it safe for us to touch base with those parts that are experiencing the pain, right? And they might say, well, now is not the time, right? And then, okay, now is not the time. And we listen to them and honor them, right? And we might find parts that are impatient with those parts. And then we say, okay, I know, I get it. You want us to be able to turn towards that pain as well. And then as the parts kind of work with each other and as they begin to get a sense for, oh, wait a minute, there's this space in this person that can understand us. The protectors feel understood. They realize that we have compassion and understanding for them from this self, from this heart place. They begin to trust us more and realize that there's power in this stance of the compassionate centered psychological state that IFS calls self. And we want to have that space be available before we turn towards the trauma.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's
So
really
we don't race past those things to go right in to that, even though we might have parts of us that want to go rescue vulnerable parts, right? We have to invite our heroic parts and our rescuer parts to kind of, yeah, I understand your wish and that's helpful. But what now we need to do is to get the system to be balanced. So by doing that, people then can then at some point be ready and then to find a way that would make it safe to interface with that traumatized part, right?
Mhm.
So that it only shares enough that the system can manage it,
Yeah.
right? Not flood it or overwhelm it.
Right. And the key sounds like is at every step of the way getting permission from those parts.
Getting the permission from the parts and helping the person return from that place that can witness those from this compassionate, calm,
Yes.
curious place, right? And bringing that place, that compassionate, calm, curious state of mind into the foreground, right? That's the whole work. And that's why spirituality is important because often if we're able to connect to our spiritual source, our spiritual practice, whether that's meditation or the connection to light or some spiritual being, um, that that self energy then is kind of flows into the system and it makes the process happen more rapidly. It allows it to happen more rapidly, right? And it's not always there for all kinds of people, but for people for whom that is an aspect of it, it's a wonderful, wonderful resource, you know.
Nice. Thank you.
Um,
We have a couple of questions, and
okay.
Sherry Rediff, our co-clerk, who's been doing a wonderful job of Zoom mastering in the background, is going to read a question for us.
So this, we have a couple in the chat, and then we'll get to Sandra Greenberg, who has her hand raised, and I can actually see her. But one of the first questions is, Tom, I was wondering if you've done any of this work with groups that are in conflict with each other and doing the work together.
Great question.
You know, I haven't worked specifically with trying to bring together two groups like that. Other than I've worked with groups, well, let's say related to the so within one of the training communities that I'm connected to, there's people who are coming from the Jewish tradition and people coming from the Muslim tradition, and often there's conflicts in those. And I have been working on finding those spaces that can hold that. So when I did my closing workshop at the IFS conference a year and a half ago, one of the things that I worked on doing was finding ways to draw and present those. Actually, for me, I relied a lot on those practices that center us, right? And the meditative practices that center us, and singing songs of the peace songs from both traditions and from the Christian tradition in particular, which was sort of my middle path for that. But one of the things that I did to prepare a community for a situation where they were going to confront an important person in their community with the fact that that person was not, that the organization was not responding strongly enough calling for a ceasefire, right? So if we're talking with the Palestinian group and or an Arab group that was feeling like they weren't heard, and what I did was I spent time first with that group, helping them to share and listening to their parts. And then once they had listened to their parts, we were able to have them speak from what in IFS calls speak from the self for your part. And when they did that with this leader, he was able to hear them in a way that I think deeply understood them, right? And I think that they felt heard after that. So it's helping both. Sometimes you can't do it right away with both groups there, but you listen to one group, you help them, and then they might be ready to speak with that other group from self, and they might not be ready. Right.
Thank
So-
you. That was from Marjorie. Thank you, Marjorie. That was an excellent question. Another is a little nuts and bolts. You mentioned the cards. Where can I find them and what are they called?
All right. So the best thing for a lot of this stuff is to go to my website, which is wingedheart.org, not .com. You'll get some kind of a card sales link. So it's winged heart, one word, WINGEDHERT.org. And there are links to the cards, links to Sharon's story, links to where you can buy those things. There's also some videos from myself about the work. So there's a lot of resources on that page if you want to know me better.
Thank you. And we'll put that in the chat. And then Sandra, I think I can ask you to unmute and you can go ahead and ask your question if you unmute.
Well, actually, I'm one of those technologically challenged people, and I think I pressed the button that put my hand up. I didn't have a question at that time.
We love you, Sandra. We understand you.
Hello and welcome.
You are with your people.
Hi, Mom.
Great.
So we do have another question.
But I could ask a question now.
But go ahead.
So or at least I'd like to have an understanding, I think, of this upcoming weekend in May, that it sounds like it's going to be an integration of the IFS work that you are familiar with and you work with extensively, and spirituality. It's not a training for IFS, is that
No,
correct?
no, it's not a training. No, we're
Right.
just using the method and we're using it in a way that's quite accessible to a wide population.
All
Right.
right.
And
So
if I may chime in, Sandra, I got so excited when I saw that this was going to be a whole weekend immersion of using IFS. As a person who loves the IFS model, I'm on the waiting list to get into a training. But it's rare and special to try to get into an IFS training. That was a big draw. I'm not going to lie, that was the main reason that I went, is that I wanted to have an immersion experience of learning IFS in a small group with a facilitator who's a very seasoned IFS therapist, but it's not being billed as a training in IFS, but it's very much an experiential immersion with IFS. And I felt like having done little intros here and there, I felt like I got a lot of the IFS experience by being allowed to be in some ways a client and having experiential exercises using IFS. It was really quite powerful, but yeah, it's not being billed as a training per se. Terrific. Very nice. Tom, this has been the delight of my birthday and a highlight of my year to get to work with you to put this together, and then to just have, what feels like an intimate conversation with 80 people present. So thank you so much for doing that. I can't wait to see you in May. And maybe some of the people who joined us today will also pop in and you'll get to meet them too.
okay, Mary. Well, thank you very much. This was a joy for me to be able to share, and nice to be able to bring together and share some of the experiences that have been in my heart since our gathering last year.
Thank you so much.